All right, today we're going to be talking about the endocrine system, which is a communication system in the body that makes long-term sustained changes. Now, unlike the nervous system, which is kind of a cell-to-cell quick communication system, which works on neurotransmitters, the endocrine system works on using a series of chemicals called hormones. The hormones are secreted from things called endocrine glands. Now remember, we had exocrine glands that secreted stuff onto surfaces like the skin, the lumen of the digestive tract. Endocrine glands secrete chemicals into the blood, and those chemicals are all called hormones, and there are different classes of hormones, which we'll get to in a minute. What do hormones do? Well, hormones make long-term changes. The changes typically are slower, but much longer lasting than, like I said, the electrical impulses in the nervous system, the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So hormones are going to make big changes in the body. And the cells that the hormones act on are called target organ cells. So what types of hormones are there out there? Well, the first type are called nonsteroid hormones. Basically, nonsteroid hormones tend to be proteins. Now, these proteins act in such a way that they interact with a receptor on the surface of a cell. So let's pretend this is a cell, and there's a receptor, which is another protein. The hormone will sit right inside of the receptor to trigger a change inside the cell. So the nonsteroid hormone is what we call the first messenger. It activates second messengers inside of the cells. So this would be the first, and the changes inside the cell would be the second. I didn't draw a nucleus or anything inside the cell. Sorry about that. Oops, sorry. Steroid hormones are different. Steroids are made out of fats, lipids, remember? Fats, lipids, steroids, they're all one type of biomolecule. These guys bind to receptors inside they can be in the cytoplasm or inside the cell's nucleus. Now, remember we talked about the lipid bilayer. What's the lipid bilayer made out of? Fats, right? Fats and lipids. What that means is that a steroid, which typically, not all of them are circular, but they can be. They can go straight through the membrane, the cell membrane, and they can even enter the nuclear envelope, which is amazing. When they do that, they can change patterns of DNA expression. So think about steroid hormones for a minute. Steroid hormones like estrogen and testosterone, they change nuclear programming. They change DNA expression, especially during puberty, right? Or during reproductive phase. So let's look at this quick little drawing, which is a much better representation than what I typically draw of nonsteroid hormones. The first messengers, here's a protein hormone, first messenger. They bind to the membrane receptor in a lock and key mechanism. See this little pointy part here is fitting right into the pointy part here. It's called induced fit. Right? Have you ever heard of that before? Induced fit is where you basically have like a key going into a lock. What that does, it actually changes the shape of this protein here, causing the membrane receptor to activate this thing called the G protein, which then turns on this enzyme, which hydrolyzes ATP twice, turning it into cyclic AMP. So as it makes cyclic AMP, it also releases two phosphate groups into the cytoplasm where they go to be recycled for other things. The cyclic AMP activates other enzymes, and then it goes on to change whatever metabolic process in the cell. So the protein messenger itself is the first messenger. The G protein here, it's literally called the G protein, is the second messenger. And when you take biology at Merced College, you're going to hear a whole lot about that. Now, steroid hormone actions, like I said, is a little different because these steroid hormones are lipid soluble. They can zip right across the phospholipid bilayer of the plasma membrane. Now, how do you get these little fats to float around in the bloodstream without caking the blood vessels, right? Interestingly, they have carrier proteins. And these carrier proteins will take 1 to sometimes up to, I think, 5 steroid hormone molecules around. And in this case, our example is estrogen. So the carrier takes 4 estrogens. It drops estrogen off. Don't worry about how that happens, okay? It's a diffusion thing. It's a concentration gradient thing. Don't worry about that right now. There are a lot of dynamics at play there. The steroid hormone is dropped off near a cell that has that's able to absorb the estrogen. The estrogen then enters through a nuclear pore and activates a receptor that's another protein floating around inside of the nucleus, okay? Once the receptor and the steroid hormone interact, once the receptor and, in this particular case, estrogen interact with one another, they lock into place through induced fit, and then they become what we call a DNA binding protein, activating E-I-E-I-N. Oh, this pen. The DNA binding protein turns on new genetic programming, making new messenger RNA, making a new protein that's specific for whatever female, or in this case, estrogen. Men do have some estrogen as well. Whatever estrogen is asking the cell to make, but it's going to be a specific effect that is targeted from estrogen. Cool, huh? So how are all these things regulated? Well, we've talked about negative and positive feedback before. Now let's review what they are. Hormones are going to be regulated by negative feedback in such a way that once a hormone is secreted, the process turns itself off, okay? So in this case, if we come back to this example, the estrogen arrives at the cell, changes the programming of the cell. The cell starts making new protein, and this protein actually usually will bind to the estrogen, turning off the process, thereby negatively regulating the induction of the protein itself. Once the protein all gets used up, then more and estrogen keeps getting dropped off, then the estrogen will turn the process back on again. So it's about building up enough product so that it blocks so that basically it's like an on-off switch, okay? The switch is on as the estrogen comes in, it's on, making more protein, but once you get enough protein, the switch blocks the estrogen, turning it off until it gets used up. Then once you run out of this, the switch gets turned back on again. Positive feedback, on the other hand, you don't see this as often, but remember, positive feedback is an amplification mechanism of physiological processes. So let's say, for example, during blood clotting, you get a cut, okay? Let's say you get a paper cut. Those are no fun, right? You get a paper cut, and oxygen initially causes the transversion, like that word, the transition of, or activation, I guess would be a better word, of fibrogen into fibrin. And then fibrin causes another chemical transition. So as time goes on, product number one, which in this case is oxygen, it turns on fibrin. Fibrin activates enzyme A and enzyme B. Enzyme A activates two more, let's say 1 and 2. B activates 3 and 4. These are all enzymes. And by this point in time, now you have a blood clot. When you have a blood clot, no more oxygen is coming in, so this turns off the whole process, and you don't have to worry about bleeding out. All right, so blood clotting is a positive feedback mechanism by which the amplification and I guess you would say the amplification and drive to stop bleeding actually stops the process. So positive feedback always ends in negative feedback. So right here, that's the negative. Each one of these are positive mechanisms. Okay, here's another example of negative feedback with insulin secretion. So over here, we're eating a cheeseburger and fries and fruit because I guess that's what you eat when you eat cheeseburger and fries. I don't know. It looks good to me, I guess. As a consequence of eating a high carbohydrate meal, we're going to have lots of glucose entering our bloodstream from intestinal absorption. The glucose circulating in our bloodstream is going to interact with certain receptors, and especially in the hypothalamus. There's going to be a trigger telling the pancreas, saying, hey, start secreting insulin because there is a heck of a lot of glucose in our bloodstream right now. The purpose of insulin is to allow cells in the body to absorb all of this glucose so that it can use it for cellular respiration, for making ATP, right? Well, it turns out, what is the first part of the body that gets slammed with all this insulin and glucose? It is the liver. So the liver, once it's activated by insulin, can start absorbing glucose, and the liver can then convert it to glycogen for storage later on, right? We always want to have a little bit of storage out there. You never know when you might need some glucose. As the liver is absorbing glucose, the glucose circulating around in your bloodstream goes down. So does the insulin, for that matter. The insulin causes the liver, and let's just say other tissues, muscle, skeletal muscle, fat, adipose tissue, even bone to some degree, but mostly muscle and fat. Oh, and your brain, right? The nervous system. All of these organs are absorbing glucose because insulin's around. And because of that, eventually, glucose levels fall. So if you look at this, glucose goes up and then comes back down. And I have it going underneath the bar here, but it goes back down in response to absorption due to insulin. Once insulin has done its job, the pancreas, oh, there's no more glucose around, the pancreas turns off insulin production. All right, so what are some of the diseases of the endocrine system? One is called hypersecretion. You let out too much hormone. That's a problem, right? One is hyposecretion, not enough hormone. We'll talk about these in a few minutes in terms of specific diseases, but the whole idea is that the endocrine system works on what we call pulsatile secretion. In other words, it's on-off secretion. My screen is bouncing around, sorry. What that means is that if you have an on-off secretion, elimination, the target cells remain very sensitive, all right, to the hormone. On the other hand, all right, if you have a situation where hormone is constantly high, so if we have a chart here and hormone goes up and it stays high, the target cells become insensitive. And this is the case with insulin resistance, right? If we go back one slide, if insulin never gets cleared from the bloodstream, you have lots and lots of insulin around all the time. Muscle, fat, bone, brain, liver, they all become insulin resistant, thereby leaving lots of glucose and insulin in the system. That's a bad thing. What ends up happening is the pancreas compensates by making more insulin. And that's where you have insulin resistance and the development of type 2 diabetes. So once insulin or target cell insensitivity happens, then you end up having hyposecretion. Sometimes it's hypersecretion. We'll get to that in a minute. An endocrinologist is a type of doctor that studies different endocrine diseases, and they come up with lots of different ways to manage endocrine disease in such ways that hyper and hyposecretion can be managed. All right, we're going to talk about another class of hormones right now called prostaglandins, PGs, prostaglandins. They're super powerful hormones. There are a lot of different types of body tissues that make them. We're familiar with prostaglandins from the prostate, right? But there are other places that prostaglandins are produced, and they are actually used in the regulation of pain in the body. Prostaglandins are produced in tissues, and once they're made, they really don't travel very far. They stay local for the most part, and they act on cells within the tissue. So we would think of a prostaglandin as something that kind of regulates its own tissue, its own gland. There are several types, prostaglandin A, E, and F, that are most frequent. They influence usually a lot of body functions. Respiration is one of the you don't need to know which prostaglandin does what. But in terms of respiration, it's local regulation. There's a prostaglandin that helps regulate the lungs such that they're able to ventilate efficiently. There is blood pressure, so prostaglandins regulate the diameter of blood vessels. Gastrointestinal secretions, there are prostaglandins there, and of course in reproduction. So in terms of the endocrine glands, we're going to list out the glands themselves, starting rostral to caudal. Okay, I wouldn't say anterior and posterior because it's top of head to tail. So remember, I mean, humans walk on two legs. This is going to be so sad. I'm going to draw a critter with 4 legs, a tail. Love that, don't you? Let's see. And then a neck. Okay, I don't know what that is, but whatever it is, it's happy today. All right, let's give it a better eye. So this would be rostral. This is caudal, right? And here would be our arms, here are the legs. And so on humans, up here, this is rostral, and down by your rump, by the glutes, would be caudal. Okay, so rostral to caudal. We have the hypothalamus and the pituitary that work together. The pineal, which is also in the brain. The pineal is super important for helping you sleep. The thyroid, the parathyroid, which work together. So let's do this. Hypothalamus and pituitary go together. The thymus, the adrenals, the pancreas, and then the ovaries and the testes. It's ovaries or testes, I would say, for that. There's a table in your book. Now, in my book, I have an older version. It was 11.1. It might be table 12.1 for you guys, since this is chapter 12. All right, let's start with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is made up of 2 areas. Okay, one is the anterior and one is the posterior. So this is going to be the anterior here. The anterior is also called the adenohypophysis or adenohypophysis. That's what we always called it when I was in school. And it makes thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, and lactogenic hormone. I'm not even going to go into the protein thing. Anyways, so how many of these are involved in reproduction? Follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. So let's look at the major hormones. Thyroid-stimulating hormone stimulates the growth and the maintenance of the thyroid gland. It also helps make or stimulates thyroid hormone. So here you have the pituitary stimulating the thyroid. Cool, right? ACTH stimulates the growth of the adrenal cortex, okay? It also stimulates the secretion of glucocorticoids, usually cortisol, but there are other glucocorticoids, not necessarily always involved in stress, but other glucocorticoids that, might regulate other goal-driven behaviors to some degree. Follicle-stimulating hormone, so here's the pituitary also controlling adrenals, okay? And then the pituitary, the anterior, controlling the gonad. The gonads would be the testes or ovaries. And basically what FSH is doing in females is causing the growth or initiating and regulating the growth and development of ovarian follicles to produce an ova and ultimately a gamete. In males, FSH stimulates sperm production. So basically what it's doing is it's regulating spermatogenesis in the testes. So FSH in females, ovaries, and also estrogen secretion, FSH in males, sperm production. Now, luteinizing hormone is also linked with follicle-stimulating hormone in that it stimulates estrogen to be produced after the follicle matures, all right? And we know we need estrogen, right, for ovulation. It actually causes ovulation. So luteinizing hormone kicks off the ovulatory event. It causes luteinization, in other words, the rupturing of the follicle, and it stimulates progesterone to be made by the corpus luteum. Now, in males, it causes the interstitial cells to secrete testosterone to support sperm production. Now, prolactin, or lactogenic hormone, produces breast development in females. Usually, it's initiated during a first phase of estrogen. Prolactin isn't, but the breast development is initiated during the estrogen surge of puberty, but then prolactin comes along to finish the job, to allow further development of mammary tissue and secretion of milk after the baby's delivered. Now, growth hormone, this is how we grow. Human growth hormone stimulates first protein anabolism. What does that mean? Muscle building, muscle growth. Okay, so anabolism is growth. It accelerates fat catabolism, okay, fat loss. So when they say, you know, that a teenager's lost their baby fat, well, that has to do with human growth hormone. GH is also HGH, human growth hormone. It's not like we have horse growth hormone, it's human, right? It also slows down glucose catabolism. What does that mean? You're not breaking down glucose as effectively. You are breaking down fat more effectively. Glucose catabolism as a teen can increase blood glucose levels higher than normal. We call that hyperglycemia. It can be good, it can be bad, it just depends. Normally it's not that big a deal. Kids burn it off. That your brain can use it. It's really helpful. It's one of the reasons why your brain actually can grow and learn very well when you're a teenager, when you have human growth hormone around. Now, if you have too much human growth hormone being secreted by the pituitary, hypersecretion results in a disease called gigantism. You get super, super tall. It also affects the bones. It makes the bones super dense. Okay, acromegaly is a condition where usually the face and the bones in the shoulders and the arms get really dense. You'll see that in a minute. Hyposecretion results in what's called pituitary dwarfism. Now, when we say the term dwarfism, yes, it is stunted growth, but there are many ways that stunted growth can happen. In this case, too little human growth hormone produced by the pituitary stops bone. The bones just don't grow. Hyposecretion is only one route. There are other genetic conditions that can lead to dwarfism that don't involve the pituitary hypothalamic axis. And there's also a condition called growth hormone insufficiency, where cells in the bones, in the growth plates, are resistant to human growth hormone, very much like fat and muscle, well, fat to some degree, but muscle becomes resistant to insulin in type 2 diabetes. So in that particular case, growth hormone insufficiency is actually a type of height diabetes, I guess you could say. So here are a couple of growth hormone abnormalities. The individual on the left here suffers from gigantism. Okay, let me change my color here. Here we go, gigantism. And the person on the right suffers from pituitary dwarfism. And in this particular case, the gigantism is the result of hypersecretion, and the pituitary dwarfism is the result of hyposecretion. Now, as I mentioned over here, not hyperglycemia, the acromegaly, you can see here in this man's face, you can see the severe squared jawline, very square chin. I know how many of you guys are thinking that looks like Thanos. Yes, it does. Maybe Thanos had a gigantism, right? How many years am I going to use this lecture talking about Thanos? All right, so that was the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis, secretes separate hormones. Antidiuretic hormone, it does exactly what it says. Antidiuretic, it stops urination, okay? Hyposecretion actually causes a condition called diabetes insipidus, where you have excessive volume of urine. In other words, antidiuretic hormone is being made, too much of it's being made, and you end up urinating a lot. Oxytocin is another hormone being made. We'll talk about that in a minute. ADH accelerates water reabsorption from the kidney and the tubules. Decreasing urine secretion, it is antidiuretic. So if you make a lot of it, you don't pee. If you make a lot of it, a lot of the anti means you don't pee. Very little anti means you do pee. So hyposecretion means very little and that means you pee a lot. All right. Oxytocin, which should have been in red here, stimulates the uterus to contract to bring on childbirth. It may also initiate labor, and in fact, Pitocin, which is a synthetic form of oxytocin, is usually administered to induce labor, and it causes the glandular cells of the breast to start releasing milk into the milk ducts for milk let down to feed the young. Now, oxytocin is also produced, interestingly, in pair bonding. So when people start dating and they like each other a lot, every time they look into each other's eyes, their oxytocin levels rise, and that feels really good. Oxytocin has also been shown to increase expression and levels when a pet owner looks into their pet's eyes, especially dogs. When a dog looks at their owners and they stare at them and you make eye contact, their oxytocin levels go up, and that happens for the human as well. So oxytocin is key in milk letdown and in pair bonding. So if you ever want to feel good, stare into your pet's eyes. All right, so here's the pituitary. They drew this opposite of what I did. The anterior is going to be on your left. The posterior is on your right. The anterior is filled with glandular tissue that secretes directly into the vasculature. It affects growth, the bone, adrenal cortex, the ACTH, thyroid stimulating hormone, gonadotropic hormones, and then prolactin. And then your posterior, this is the neurohypophysis, remember? Neurohypophysis. What happens is you have a series of hypothalamic nerve cells that fire and deliver the ADH or oxytocin directly to blood vessels here. So here you have glands that make the hormones. Here the hormone is made up here in the neurons, and it's shipped down through the axons and secreted into blood vessels. Now the hypothalamus, which is right up here, okay, connected to the pituitary, is where the ADH and the oxytocin is made, like I mentioned. After production, it's shipped down to the pituitary, to the posterior, excuse me, and secretion happens as a consequence of action potential or nerve stimulation. Lots of other things are controlled by the hypothalamus. We can talk about those, and actually, we don't talk about them too much more. You would talk about them a lot in a psychology class, though, which is super cool. The hypothalamus is called a master regulatory organ in the body. It controls goal-directed behaviors. In other words, things like thirst. You have to be hydrated. You have to have water in your body. If you don't, your hypothalamus will make you thirsty. Appetite, temperature regulation, body weight, all kinds of things are regulated by the hypothalamus. One of the ways the hypothalamus works is by bossing around other glands. Number one, the thyroid. The thyroid gland helps regulate how your body uses energy. In other words, it can accelerate catabolism. Okay, remember, catabolism means to tear things apart. Okay, I always think of catabolism. If you forget about anabolism and catabolism, which does which, just remember cats break stuff. Okay. Catabolism breaks down other molecules. It's just what worked for me. Accelerating catabolism through the activation of thyroxine and tridiothyrine, T4 and T3, allows our body to change its metabolic rate, burning up stored energy that we already have. Okay, calcitonin, on the other hand, it helps regulate blood calcium levels. In other words, if you have a lot of blood calcium, if you have calcium in your blood, it's going to stop the body from taking calcium out of your bones. Okay, you don't need more calcium in your blood if you already have adequate calcium in your blood to do certain jobs like nervous system activation. So calcitonin decreases the blood calcium concentration by inhibiting the breakdown of bone. So where do these hormones all live? So the thyroid gland is just underneath the larynx. It's underneath I guess you would say inferior to the laryngeal cartilage. The parathyroid glands are on the posterior edges of the thyroids. And they look like, in this picture, like these little brown organs. You have the superior and the inferior. Of course, superior is on top, inferior is on the bottom. And you can see the tracheal cartilage right here, the rings of cartilage that surround the trachea, holding it open so that you can breathe. Now, hyperthyroidism is where there's a whole lot of secretion occurring from the thyroid. T3 and T4 is super high. It seriously increases your metabolic rate, which may sound like it's really great because, you can eat anything you want, right? On the other hand, it's not really great for other organs in your body. It's difficult for your heart because your heart rate will increase. It is characterized by restlessness and exophthalmos, which is protruding eyes, kind of bulging eyes. Graves' disease is a type of hyperthyroidism that is inherited. It's a genetic disease, and it leads to, over a very short period of time, in children, the characteristic exophthalmos and very, I guess you would say, very light body weight. Now, hypothyroidism, okay, a low thyroid, hyposecretion of T3 and T4 happens from, there are a lot of different reasons why this can happen, but the most common is called a goiter. This woman in this picture has a growth on her throat, and this growth is actually a hypertrophied or enlarged thyroid gland. What happens is the thyroid converts iodine, dietary iodine, into T3, T4. If there's no iodine around, there's nothing around to make T3 and T4. So if the thyroid can't make T3 and T4, what happens is the pituitary, remember, the anterior pituitary communicates with the thyroid. It bosses the thyroid around. And if the thyroid is not making T3, T4, the anterior pituitary starts making more hormone to activate the thyroid. It starts yelling louder. Well, what happens is the thyroid starts growing and growing and growing until it develops into a goiter. And it's very simple to fix this. This is why iodine is in regular table salt. So if you go home and you look at the round container of salt, it says iodinized salt. It's there, it's intended, the iodine's in our diet, and it's intended to keep people from developing a goiter. So hyposecretion leads to, in adults, a goiter. If it happens early during childhood development, it leads to creatinism, which is a form of mental retardation. The brain doesn't develop normally. And myxedema is edema or swelling and sluggishness as a consequence of, in addition to having a goiter, not having adequate amounts of T3 and T4 around. Now, the parathyroids are what are making that calcitonin. Okay, the parathyroid gland makes the calcitonin. It also makes parathyroid hormone. What does this thing do? Parathyroid hormone is calcitonin, and it regulates the calcium concentration in the body. So here's how the parathyroids work. You have a low calcium level. The parathyroid hormone secretion, calcitonin or parathyroid hormone, breaks down calcium from bone matrix, releasing it into the blood. Normal blood calcium levels are reestablished. These guys stop making, the parathyroids stop making calcitonin. The process stops. Haha, negative feedback. High blood calcium levels, because you're drinking milk. Remember, happy cows of California making lots of milk for us. The calcitonin secretion from the thyroid increases. It stops the breakdown of bone, and you have regular calcium levels. So let's talk about the adrenal glands now. The adrenal glands are broken into two sections, the cortex and the medulla. So we'll look at a picture in a minute. But here's something for you guys to be aware of. Whenever you hear the word cortex, it means you kind of have columns. You have stacks of cells. And cortex is usually abbreviated CX. So that would be the adrenal cortex. This would be the medulla. Okay? And the medulla is just a bunch of cells that are kind of smushed together in one area. Okay? So the adrenal cortex makes the glucocorticoids, all right? Mostly cortisol, but also which can also be called hydrocortisone. It makes mineral corticoids, aldosterone, which it regulates your kidneys. And then it also makes some sex hormones, the male sex hormones, the androgens. Okay, so androgens would basically be testosterone. Okay, it can make some estrogen, but depends on who you are. So here's an example. Oh, look at that. Cortex, medulla, cortex, stacks of cells. On the outside, you have a capsule, which is made up of a bunch of connective tissue holding the organ together. You have the cortex, the inner zone, and then the medulla that looks like these little round clusters. They secrete their own hormones. The adrenals sit atop the kidneys, and they have their own vasculature, a vein and an artery that feed the adrenal glands that branch off of the renal artery and renal vein here. And so the adrenals basically look like little hats that sit on top of the kidneys. All right, so the 3 cell layers on the outside, the outer, middle, and inner layer, mineral corticoids, glucocorticoids, and the sex hormones. So if you come back here you go, outer, middle, inner. Outer, middle, inner. Mineral corticoids regulate the salts of your body. I guess that's the way to think of it. So, sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium. They're all regulated so that the kidney can get rid of them if you have excess amount. Now, what do the glucocorticoids do? All kinds of stuff. They help maintain blood glucose, okay, in addition to, it's in a separate way, but it does it in addition to insulin. Basically, it helps regulate new glucose production from, believe it or not, amino acids that we eat, which are the product of protein breakdown. It also helps make glucose from fatty acid breakdown. So in other words, your adrenals can help you convert protein and fat into glucose, which is amazing. These steps take place. It's much more complicated. You'll hear about how that happens in the body in Bio-50 when you come to Merced College. Glucocorticoids play a huge role in maintaining blood pressure. They make it possible for epinephrine or adrenaline and norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline, to be maintained, to be secreted at levels that'll help maintain the resting tone, the appropriate resting tone of blood vessels, arteries, and veins, all right, which maintain blood pressure. So it maintains vasoconstriction. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, we know, have an anti-inflammatory effect if it's at the right level. And it usually helps us recover from stressful infections like a microorganism infection, for example. Anti-immunity, anti-allergy effects. They help regulate the number of lymphocytes. And glucocorticoids very, very quickly increase when we are under stress. So remember, that is, if we come all the way back here, that is going to be our, I went too far. That's going to be our cortisol, all right? Stress, cortisol. And it helps us get out of these stressful situations by bringing about other stress responses. So one of the things I want you to think about when you think of stress isn't just how do you feel when your test is coming up, right? When you take your quiz in class or on Sunday or whenever you take your quiz. Stress is the response that your body has when you are, when your body's being not threatened necessarily, but when your body's being pushed out of homeostasis, when it's being pushed out of its healthy, happy zone. So stress responses, let's say, for example, a high blood glucocorticoid level that causes your thymus to atrophy, that increases or decreases the number of white blood cells. So the thymus has to do with white blood cell production in adults. Inhibited inflammatory response, okay? So it kind of shuts down inflammation. Remember, glucocorticoids are going to be things like hydrocortisone. What happens when you get a rash? That's inflammation. You put hydrocortisone on it, exogenous glucocorticoid, and it brings down the inflammation. It does increase the mobilization of fat and tissue proteins. In other words, you break down protein and fat when you have lots of glucocorticoids floating around, and that can lead to hyperglycemia. Now let's talk about the medulla. of the adrenal. So remember, you have the cortex on the outside, and it's three layers, inner, outer, middle. And then you have the medulla, which is made of those little round kind of clusters all over the place. The medulla is what we're really associating with fight or flight. It makes epinephrine, which is adrenaline, or norepinephrine, which is noradrenaline. What do they do? Epinephrine and norepinephrine usually help us resist stress by allowing a sympathetic stimulation, a fight or flight response to occur. Okay, how does that resist stress? It gets you out of the situation where you're going to be eaten by the hungry bear. It's always my fear. Now, when the adrenal glands have abnormalities, like, say, for example, Cushing's syndrome or an adrenal tumor, hypersecretion, too much glucocorticoid, actually, even though it helps, a low level, a normal level helps us regulate our body fat and so forth. Cushing's syndrome is characterized as producing in children kind of a chubby appearance, a hump on the back, which is a fat on the back, elevated blood sugar levels, because remember, we mentioned that the glucocorticoids regulate the release of energy from protein and fat. Well, that leads to, because it's making more glucose, elevated sugar levels, and it down regulates, if we come back here, the number of lymphocytes, so they get sick a lot. All right. Once a child starts getting the appropriate treatment, which is regulating or knocking out using adrenocorticotropic regulators, they're medications that bring down the levels of glucocorticoids. This is what the boy looked like 4 months later. So it's clear that the poor little guy, it wasn't that he just weighed a lot. It was that his body had consistent hypersecretion of glucocorticoids that brought on this elevated response. Hypersecretion can also lead to masculinization in women. So hypersecretion of adrenal glucocorticoids can cause inappropriate masculinization of women. So this is a woman who is she has 2 X chromosomes, but you could see that she has increased muscle mass, definitely decreased breast development, and has much more of a weight distribution, more similar to a man than a woman. Hyposecretion results in what's called Addison's disease, which basically results in muscle weakness, loss of appetite, a frail individual, someone who's nauseous very much, reduced blood sugar, just not lots of energy. So adrenal dysfunction profoundly regulates and changes somebody's ability to make it through the world, frankly. Okay, those are the adrenals. Now let's move on to the pancreas. The pancreas, makes 2 hormones, glucagon and insulin. We've talked a little bit about insulin. Insulin's made by the beta cells within the pancreatic islets, also called the islets of Langerhans. And glucagon is secreted by alpha cells, okay? Glucagon breaks down glycogen. So when you have very little blood sugar or low blood sugar, glucagon secreted to break down glycogen in the liver into glucose, so that you have blood sugar floating around again. Insulin helps convert glucose into glucagon. So they work opposite of each other. They're antagonistic. Glucagon increases blood glucose levels by accelerating liver it's called glycogenolysis. In other words, it converts glucagon to glucose, and then the insulin does the opposite process, which right there increases glucose metabolism by cells. So here's a real simple representation of the posterior view of the pancreas. So the pancreas, this is anterior. The pancreas has a large pancreatic duct that produces, so the pancreas does more than make glucagon and insulin, okay? There are other cells, the exocrine cells, which make enzymes. The enzymes are released into the duodenum, so the enzymes would be things like lipase, it's lipase, amylase. There are different proteases, so everything we eat, not everything, but most things we eat, most biomolecules have an enzyme that'll break them down, made in the pancreas. The beta cells and the alpha cells all exist in a pancreatic islet, which is a separate set of cells, and the insulin and glucagon is released straight into a pancreatic vein, which then takes the hormones out into body circulation. So, of course, we're all very familiar with pancreatic diseases, diabetes mellitus, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is when you have hyposecretion of insulin, which is what? The alpha or beta cells? Tell me. Beta. So I always remember glucagon comes before G, comes before I. See G, H, I, yeah. So G comes before I in the alphabet, which means A comes before B. So glucagon, alpha, insulin, beta. Type 1 results in is the result of hyposecretion of insulin. Type 2 means that the target cells are insensitive to insulin. I think many of us are already familiar with this. So glucose in type 2 diabetes, well, actually in both, glucose can't enter cells, but through different mechanisms. Number one is because you don't have insulin around, because the beta cells have been killed by the immune system. Type 2 is because you have glucose insensitivity. The cells in your body just don't listen to glucose anymore, therefore they don't absorb, insulin anymore, therefore they don't absorb glucose. So this is a really long pathway showing what happens when modifications of insulin in diabetes occurs. So insulin is decreased here, increased blood glucose level, hyperglycemia, and so on. So you can read through this on your own. Okay, we're going to be covering more of the reproductive system when we talk about the male and female reproductive system. We're just going to introduce the basic female and male sex glands. The ovaries are the female sex glands, which produce, of course, hormones. The ovarian follicles are going to be, the ovarian follicles are going to be producing estrogen, and the corpus luteum is going to be producing progesterone. We'll talk about where these are and what they look like in another chapter. What does estrogen do? It feminizes the body. It helps direct the development and the maturation of mammary tissue in females and the external genitals. It helps the female body develop its fat distribution, and it initiates the menstrual cycle every month. In the male sex glands, the testes, they produce interstitial cells, or they contain interstitial cells that make testosterone. And again, we'll be talking about this much more later on. But basically, what does testosterone do? It masculinizes a body. It helps with the maturation of the external genitals. It also causes the growth of a more dense and, I guess you would say, wiry hair on the face and actually all over the body in males. It also initiates voice changes in puberty by changing the size and the texture of the vocal cords to some degree, but also I guess you'd say the Adam's apple, the voice box, and it also helps develop much more robust musculature and gives rise to a fat distribution or a body distribution much more typical of a male. So we're going to talk about both the male and female reproductive systems separately. Okay, you just need to be familiar with what parts of each system makes testosterone or estrogen for now. Let's move on to the thymus. The thymus plays a huge role in the production of thymocytes when you're young, but in making white blood cells, all right? The thymus makes thymosin, and thymosin is a huge part of the development and maintenance of the body's immune system, the white blood cells. That's all we're going to talk about with the thymus right now, because the thymus is an organ that's located close to your heart, okay? We'll look at it a little more when we talk about the heart and where it's localized in the body. The placenta is only present in females, and it's an organ that does have an endocrine function, but it's only around during pregnancy, and it's delivered after the baby is delivered. So the hormones that it makes is chorionic gonadotropins, estrogens, and progesterone, pretty much female hormones. And what do? They help maintain the corpus luteum, or the lining of the uterus during pregnancy. It's a big deal. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm already tired. I'm making this lecture late, so I'm sleepy. My pineal gland is saying, hey, Dr. Val, here's some melatonin. You know you go to bed at like 9:30. It's 9:23, and Dr. Val is fighting it today. It's all right. We're almost done. The pineal gland is near the roof of the third ventricle, and basically, in younger people, the glandular tissue is really robust and kind of squishy in children and in young adults, which might be partly why children and young adults sleep really well. As we age, the pineal gland does undergo fibrous changes, and it can, depending on the person's health and other elements in their life, it can become calcified. And so what that does is it decreases the amount of melatonin that's produced as the day goes on. So when the sun comes up and the day gets brighter, your pineal doesn't make much melatonin, okay? And so melatonin, actually not melatonin is made from serotonin, and what it does is it makes you sleepy. The pineal is also called the third eye because it influences the activity, secretory activity of melatonin as a result of day length. And so as it gets darker and darker and darker, your pineal starts making melatonin, which makes you sleepy. Does it really work when you take it in a tablet form? Yes, just don't take too much because you will have nightmares. So here's our melatonin. Inhibits ovarian activity, actually, and it regulates the body's internal clock, or circadian rhythm, as it's also called. When we have too much secretion or too little, that's called seasonal affective disorder or winter depression. And it's a form of depression that happens when you don't have enough sunlight to stop the production of melatonin. So if it's dark too much, you have lots of melatonin around and you just get really kind of depressed and sleepy all the time. Oops. There are other endocrine structures in the body, the stomach itself, the intestines, the kidney. They all make hormones that act in an endocrine fashion. The atrial walls of the heart make hormones. Fat storing cells make leptin, telling the brain, hey, I'm full of fat. You don't need to eat anymore. So there are other endocrine structures. The structures that we talked about from rostral to caudal, though, are the ones that will be on this week's quiz. All right, folks, I'll see you on the next lecture.